At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, the Belgian sky was not black, but a bruised, suffocating grey. The Ardennes forest, a jagged landscape of frozen pine and limestone ridges, held its breath. For the men of the 106th Infantry Division, the silence was more terrifying than the noise. It was a cold that didn't just bite, it consumed. It seeped through the standard-issue wool greatcoats, bypassed the layers of flannel, and settled into the marrow of their bones. In this frozen wasteland, 26-year-old Corporal Silas Vance sat in the corner of a partially collapsed motor pool, his hands blackened with a mixture of graphite grease and frostbite. He wasn't holding a rifle, he was holding a welding torch, the blue flame flickering against the skeletal remains of a scavenged truck chassis. The world was about to end for the American line, but the High Command didn't know it yet. They called this a quiet sector, a place for green troops to get seasoned and for exhausted units to rest. But as Silas Vance looked out through the jagged hole in the stone wall, he didn't see a quiet sector. He saw a graveyard in the making. For 3 days, the distant, rhythmic thud of heavy machinery had been vibrating through the frozen grounder low-frequency growl that the officers dismissed as atmospheric, echoes or German supply movements. Vance knew better. He had spent his youth in the shipyards of Newport News, welding the hulls of destroyers. He knew the sound of heavy steel moving under power. He knew the sound of a predator. The official military strategy for the Ardennes relied on the 57mm anti-tank gun. On paper, it was a formidable weapon. In reality, against the new generation of German armor, it was a tragic joke. The 57mm shells were effectively high-velocity pebbles. When they struck the 5-inch thick frontal glacis plate of a King Tiger, they didn't penetrate. They shattered, leaving behind nothing but a silver scuff mark on the dark yellow paint of the Nazi behemoths. The American soldiers on the front lines were being asked to hold back a tidal wave with a screen door. Silas Vance had watched a crew from the 422nd Infantry Regiment try to engage a stray Panzer for 3 days earlier. They had fired 4 rounds at point-blank range. The Panzer hadn't even stopped. It simply rotated its turret and vaporized the crew with a single 75mm high-explosive shell. If you want to see how a man with a welding torch and a pile of scrap metal redefined the physics of anti-tank warfare when the generals had already given up, please hit that like button. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories of battlefield innovation to life. Vance was a man who lived in the margins of the manual. His nickname, Greasy, wasn't just a commentary on his appearance. It was an acknowledgement of his habitat. While his peers were digging foxholes in the permafrost, Vance was scavenging. He saw the battlefield not as a place of destruction, but as a hardware store of immense, violent potential. The official supply lines were choked by the weather. The fog was so thick that the Allied air superiority, the one thing the Americans truly relied on, was non-existent. The P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts were grounded on airfields in France and England, their pilots pacing in frustration. Silas didn't wait for the planes. He went to the wrecks. 2 miles behind the current line, AP-38 had performed a forced landing in a beet field a week prior. The pilot was gone, but the airframe remained. Vance didn't care about the guns or the radio. He wanted the hydraulic stabilizers. He spent 12 hours in a blizzard, stripping the high pressure cylinders from the twinkled Devil. To anyone else, it was junk. To Vance, it was the only way to solve the problem of recoil. A standard Bazooka M1 was a lightweight tube that fired a small rocket. It was portable, but it lacked the punch to kill a heavy tank from the front. If you increased the size of the warhead, the recoil would shatter the shoulder of the man firing it. But Vance had a theory. If he used aircraft-grade hydraulics to create a floating barrel assembly, He could fire a projectile 3 times the size of a standard rocket, without the weapon kicking like a mule. His workshop was a nightmare of industrial debris. He had found a length of heavy-duty piping in the ruins of a local brewery, thick-walled, industrial-grade steel designed to withstand immense pressure. It was 7 feet long and weighed 40 pounds on its own. He mated the brewery pipe to the P-38's hydraulic struts using crude, overbuilt welds that looked like rows of scarred flesh. For ammunition, he turned to the British. The British Piatha projector, infantry, anti-tank was a notoriously temperamental weapon that used a massive spring to launch a shaped charge. The weapon itself was hated, but the warheads were magnificent. They contained a massive amount of high explosive, capable of burning through thick armor, if they could only be delivered accurately. Vance spent his nights disassembling unexploded PIAT rounds, harvesting the shaped charges, and mounting them onto improvised rocket motors he'd fashioned from salvaged German Nebelwerfer scraps. The result was a monstrosity. It was a 7-foot-long, 80-pound tube of mismatched metal. It had no optical sights, no ergonomic grip, and no official designation. He simply called it the stovepipe. On the evening of December 15th, Colonel Aris Thorne, a man whose uniform remained impossibly pressed despite the humidity of the fog, conducted an inspection of the motor pool. Thorne was a by-the-book officer who believed that discipline was the primary factor in winning a war. When he saw Vance hunched over the stovepipe, he didn't see a genius. He saw a derelict. Thorne kicked the heavy steel tripod Vance had fashioned for the weapon. "What is this trash, Corporal?" he barked, his voice echoing off the damp stone walls. Vance didn't look up immediately. He finished a weld, waited for the glow to fade, and then pushed his goggles up. "It's an equalizer, sir," Vance replied, his voice raspy from inhaling smoke. Thorne scoffed, walking a circle around the weapon. "It's a pipe bomb on a stick. You've destroyed government properties. Scavenging from a downed aircraft is a court-martial offense. This thing is more likely to explode and kill the crew than it is to scratch a German tank. Look at the welds. Look at the lack of a proper carriage. It's an embarrassment to the United States Army. The 57 MMS aren't working, Colonel," Vance said, his tone dangerously flat. "I watched the second platoon get erased because their shells bounced. This won't bounce." Thorne leaned in, his face inches from Vance's. "You will dismantle this heap of scrap immediately. If I see it again, I'll have you breaking rocks in Leavenworth before the spring thaw. We have a chain of command and an industrial complex for a reason. We don't rely on shipyard rejects and their toys. Is that understood?" Vance stood his ground, the cold iron of the stovepipe resting against his leg. "Understood, sir." But Vance didn't dismantle it. He hid it under a tarpaulin soaked in motor oil. He knew the weather hadn't just grounded the planes. It had masked the sound of the German build-up. And he knew that the industrial complex Thorne spoke of was currently 1,000 miles away, while the German steel was less than 5. The breaking point came at 5:30 the next morning. The watch on the Rhine began, not with a whimper, but with the roar of over 2,000 guns. The German artillery barrage was the most concentrated of the entire war on the Western Front. The earth in the Ardennes didn't just shake, it liquefied. Trees were snapped like toothpicks, and the fog turned into a swirling cauldron of snow, dirt, and cordite. Vance was thrown from his cot as a 150mm shell impacted the roof of the motor pool. The stone walls that had stood for 200 years collapsed in a heartbeat. Through the choking dust, Vance didn't reach for his carbine. He crawled through the rubble, his fingers bleeding as he clawed at the frozen earth, until he felt the rough texture of the oil-soaked tarp. The stovepipe was still there. Outside, the world was screaming. The 2nd Panzer Division, the Vienna Division, was punching through the thin American line with the weight of a sledgehammer. The initial reports coming into the command post were panicked and fragmented. Tanks in the tree line, infantry bypassed, anti-tank guns destroyed. Colonel Thorne's by-the-book defense was disintegrating in minutes. The 57mm guns he had touted were being crushed under the treads of Panther tanks before they could even be unlimbered. The fog was so thick that the German tanks were appearing out of the mist at 50 yards too close for artillery. Too close for anything but suicide. Vance emerged from the ruins of the motor pool, the 80-pound stovepipe balanced on his shoulder like a cross. He saw a young private, a kid named Miller, who couldn't have been older than 19. Huddled behind a shattered stone fountain, Miller was clutching a bazooka, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't load the rocket. Miller. Vance shouted over the roar of the incoming shells. Drop that toy. Grab the bag next to the workbench, the green one. Miller looked up, his eyes wide with shell-shocked terror. Corporal, the colonel said. The colonel is currently hiding in a cellar, Vance roared. Grab the bag or die in the snow. Miller scrambled into the ruins and emerged with a heavy canvas satchel containing the improvised PIAT-based rockets. Together, the two men began to lug the stovepipe toward the ridge overlooking the main road into the village. They weren't moving like soldiers. They were moving like laborers, sweating despite the sub-zero temperatures, dragging a weapon born of desperation toward a fight that everyone said they had already lost. As they reached the crest of the hill, the fog parted for a fleeting second. Below them, the road was a river of steel. Leading the column wasn't a Panzer IV or even a Panther. It was a King Tiger 70 tons of Krupp steel, mounting an 88mm gun that could kill a building from 2 miles away. It was the invincible Predator of the Ardennes, and it was heading straight for the battalion headquarters. Vance slammed the heavy tripod into the frozen mud. He didn't have a rangefinder. He didn't have a ballistic computer. He had a notched piece of scrap tin and a welder's intuition for how metal breaks. He looked at the King Tiger, then at the hideous 7-foot-long pipe in front of him. Load it, Vance whispered. The war was about to find out what happens when the official designs fail, and the man with the welding torch takes over. In the next few minutes, the stovepipe would either become a legend or the most expensive pipe bomb in military history. By 6:15 that morning, the temperature had plummeted to a bone-cracking 12 degrees below zero. The fog was no longer a mist. It was a physical weight, thick with the smell of wet wool, sulfur, and the metallic temps of approaching armor. On the limestone ridge overlooking the Wilts Valley, Silas, Vance, and Private Miller were struggling with a weapon that theoretically shouldn't have existed. The stovepipe was 80 pounds of dead weight, and in the freezing mud, every inch of movement was a battle against physics. The tripod, which Vance had salvaged from a broken M1917 machine gun, and reinforced with welded rebar, kept sinking into the slush. Every time the ground shifted, the crude tin sights Vance had notched onto the barrel moved out of alignment. The technical obstacles were mounting faster than the German infantry. The hydraulic fluid Vance had stripped from the P-38. Lightning was designed for the high-altitude chill of the stratosphere, but it hadn't been tested in a stationary reservoir on a Belgian hillside. As the cold deepened, the viscosity of the oil changed. It was becoming sluggish, thickening into a gel that threatened to lock the recoil mechanism. If the hydraulics failed to engage when the trigger was pulled, the massive back pressure from the improvised rocket motor would likely split the brewery pipe wide open, turning the weapon into a 7-foot pipe bomb that would vaporize Vance and Miller instantly. Miller's hands were shaking so violently that he dropped one of the modified PIAT rounds into the snow. The warhead, a 3-pound cone of high explosive designed to focus a jet of molten metal through 4 inches of steel, hissed as it hit the slush. "Pick it up, Miller," Vance hissed, his voice a low growl through cracked lips. If the fuse gets wet, we're just throwing rocks." Miller's face was a mask of grey terror. He was a replacement from a farm in Ohio, a boy who had been taught that the Army's equipment was the best in the world. Now, he was being asked to stake his life on a weapon held together by shipyard welds and scavenged aircraft parts. The sounds from the valley below were shifting. The rhythmic clatter of the King Tiger's tracks each, individual link weighing as much as a man was, joined by the high-pitched whine of the Maybach engines straining against the incline. These were Tiger IIs of the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, the apex predators of the German Wehrmacht. Each one carried the KWK 44 88mm gun, a weapon that could punch through an American Sherman tank from 2 miles away. Against these monsters, the official American doctrine suggested flanking maneuvers and air support. But there was no air support in this fog, and there was no room to flank on this narrow mountain pass. As Vance adjusted the elevation screw on the stovepipe, he felt a strange sense of calm that only comes when the options have been reduced to zero. He wasn't thinking about the Medal of Honor or the grand strategy of the Western Front. He was thinking about the grain of the steel. In the Newport News shipyards, he'd learned that every piece of metal has a breaking point, a moment where the pressure exceeds the structural integrity and the atoms simply give up. He looked at the King Tiger emerging from the mist 400 yards away. It was a rolling fortress of layered steel, sloped at aggressive angles to deflect incoming fire. To the generals, it was an invincible symbol of German engineering. To Vance, it was just a larger version of a boiler that needed to be vented. His mind drifted for a heartbeat to the letter he'd received from his father 3 months prior. His father, still working the dry docks, had complained about the quality of the rivets they were being sent. "They're building these things for speed," Silas, his father, had written. "Not for the long haul. They're skipping the tempering." Vance realized the same was true here. The American military-industrial complex had built the 57mm anti-tank guns for a war of mobility, a war where they expected the enemy to be light and fast. They hadn't planned for the long haul. They hadn't planned for the Ardennes. They had prioritized the bureaucracy of mass production over the reality of the front line. If you want to see how this technician's understanding of structural failure allowed him to find the one weak point in the most heavily armored tank of the war, please hit that like button. Every interaction ensures these stories of grit and innovation aren't buried by time. The emotional weight of the moment began to press down on him. He could hear the screams of wounded men drifting up from the village. The 106th was being slaughtered in their foxholes. He saw a squad of Americans from the 424th Regiment try to make a stand near a stone bridge. They fired their rifles, the pitter-patter of .30 caliber rounds doing nothing against the Tiger's frontal plate. Then the Tiger's turret rotated a slow hydraulic movement that looked almost bored. A single flash of orange light, a thunderous crack, and the squad was gone. There was no smoke, just a red mist and a hole where the bridge had been. Vance felt a surge of cold, white-hot indignation. It wasn't just at the Germans. It was at the men like Colonel Thorne, who sat in heated basements and spoke of official channels, while boys like Miller were being turned into paste because they didn't have the right tools. The stovepipe was ugly. It was a violation of every regulation in the field manual. It was a scrap metal weapon. But as Vance looked through the notched tin sight, he knew it was the only thing in the entire Ardennes that was actually honest. It was a weapon built by a man who knew he was going to die if it didn't work. The turning point came at 6:42. A green flare hissed into the sky from the German lines, the signal for the general assault. The King Tiger at the head of the column accelerated, its massive exhaust pipes belching blue-black smoke into the fog. It wasn't just one tank anymore. Behind it, 2 more Tigers and a platoon of Panzer grenadiers were moving up. They were bypasses the main road and taking the high ground, the very ridge where Vance and Miller were hidden. "They're coming up the slope," Miller whimpered, his hands hovering over the loading port of the stovepipe. "Corporal, we gotta go. We gotta get back to the CP. The CP is gone," Miller, Vance said, his eyes never leaving the lead tank. "If we run, they catch us in the open. If we stay, we might just take one of these bastards with us." Suddenly, the lead Tiger stopped. Its commander, a veteran with a scarred face and a black Panzer wrap, popped the hatch. He stood up, binoculars in hand, looking remarkably casual. He was less than 300 yards away. He scanned the ridge, his eyes passing over the pile of rubble where Vance and Miller were crouched. He didn't see a threat. He saw a destroyed motor pool and a couple of stragglers. He signaled for his driver to turn the tank, exposing the thinner side armor of the turret as he prepared to direct the infantry. This was the moment. The Tiger was showing a vulnerability, but as Vance reached for the ignition, switcher modified, Jeep starter button wired to a series of dry cell batteries, his heart stopped. The wires, brittle from the cold and stressed by the movement of the tripod, had snapped. The copper core was exposed, but the connection was dead. The stovepipe, the vulture of the Ardennes, was silent. Vance didn't panic. He couldn't afford to. He pulled a small, grease-stained pocket knife from his belt. His fingers were so numb he could barely feel the handle. He began to strip the insulation from the wires, his breath coming in ragged gasps that turned to ice on his collar. Below them, the German infantry began to trot up the incline, their MP-40s held at the ready. They were 200 yards away, then 150. Vance jammed the two wires together, holding them in place with his bare thumb and forefinger. The raw electricity bit into his skin, a sharp, stinging sensation that was the only thing he could feel in the sub-zero air. He looked at Miller, loaded now. Miller slid the modified PIAT round into the brewery pipe. The fit was too tight. The ice had caused the metal to contract. Miller had to shove it home with the heel of his palm. Vance sighted the weapon. He wasn't aiming for the center of the tank. He was aiming for the turret ring, the narrow gap where the massive turret met the hull. It was a shot that required a degree of precision the stovepipe shouldn't have been capable of. But Vance knew the ballistics of the British-shaped charge. He knew how the gas would expand. He pressed the wires together with all the strength left in his hands. The world disappeared in a sheet of white flame. The stovepipe didn't just fire. It roared with the sound of a jet engine. The P-38's hydraulic struts groaned as they absorbed the massive recoil. The oil inside screaming under the sudden pressure. A trail of fire streaked across the snowy slope, a jagged line of orange cutting through the grey fog. The projectile struck the King Tiger exactly where the turret met the chassis. For a millisecond, nothing happened. Then the physics of the shaped charge took over. 3 pounds of high explosive detonated, focusing a jet of superheated copper at over 20,000 feet per second. It didn't just punch through the armor, it vaporized it. The jet of plasma entered the fighting compartment of the Tiger, instantly igniting the 88mm shells stored in the racks. The 70-ton tank didn't just stop, it erupted. The turret, weighing over 10 tons, was blown clean off the hull, spiraling 30 feet into the air like a discarded toy. A column of fire shot 50 feet into the sky, momentarily clearing the fog in a 300-yard radius. The German infantry, who a second ago had been laughing and shouting orders, froze. They looked at the burning wreck of their invincible leader, and then they looked up at the ridge. They didn't see a battalion. They saw a flash of fire from a weapon they didn't recognize, a weapon that sounded like a plane and hit like a battleship. Vance didn't wait to celebrate. He grabbed the hot smoking barrel of the stovepipe, ignoring the smell of his own scorched gloves. Miller. Next round. There's another one right behind him. The laughter of the German offensive had just been silenced by the sound of a brewery pipe and a shipyard welder's rage. The battle for the pass had begun, and the scrap metal weapon was just getting started. At exactly 7:12 on the morning of December 16th, the tactical reality of the Ardennes forest shifted. The burning carcass of the Lead King Tiger was a 70-ton beacon of black smoke and orange fire, casting long, dancing shadows across the snow. For Silas Vance, the victory lasted only as long as it took to draw a single, freezing breath. The stovepipe was no longer just a weapon. It was a heat-soaked liability. The heavy-duty brewery pipe, never intended to handle the internal ballistics of a high-velocity rocket motor, was radiating a shimmering haze of heat. The metal was beginning to ping, a sharp, metallic sound that told Vance the molecular structure of the steel was under immense thermal stress. In the shipyards, he'd seen pipes like this burst under half the pressure, sending shards of iron through anything in their path. The immediate problem wasn't just the metallurgy, it was the physics of the battlefield. The explosion of the first Tiger had cleared a pocket of fog, leaving Vance and Miller exposed on the ridge. To the German units moving up the valley, the source of the fire was no longer a mystery. A second Tiger II, its turret painted with the number 213, began to traverse its long 88mm gun toward their position. At the same time, a squad of Panzer grenadiers, Leet infantry trained to support armor, was already peeling off the road. They were moving in a disciplined V formation, using the dense pine trunks for cover as they scrambled up the 45-degree incline. They were less than 110 yards away, and they were armed with MG-42 machine guns that could fire 1,200 rounds per minute. "They're flanking us, Corporal," Miller screamed. He was curled into a ball, his hands pressed over his ears. The overpressure from the stovepipe's first shot had ruptured his left eardrum, and a thin trickle of dark blood was freezing against his jawline. The kid was reaching his breaking point. He wasn't seeing a tactical situation anymore. He was seeing the end of the world. Vance didn't look at the infantry. He couldn't afford to. His entire world was narrowed down to the second Tiger. If that tank fired its main gun, the ridge would be leveled, and the motor pool where 30 wounded Americans were currently being treated in the cellar would be buried alive. Vance grabbed a handful of frozen slush and smeared it over the hydraulic cylinders of the P-38 struts. The water hissed and turned to steam instantly. The hydraulics were leaking. A fine mist of red flammable fluid was spraying from a cracked seal near the rear weld. If a single spark from the next launch hit that mist, the stovepipe would turn into a flamethrower with Vance at the center. Deep inside, Vance felt a cold, hollow sensation. It wasn't fear. It was the realization of the math. He had 4 improvised PIAT rounds left. He had 1 leaking weapon. He had 100 Germans closing in. He thought of his mother's kitchen in Virginia, the smell of burnt toast, and the sound of the radio. It felt like a memory from a different century. He realized then that he was likely going to die on this ridge, branded a thief and a failure by the men who were supposed to lead him. He felt a surge of bitter irony. Colonel Thorne was probably miles away by now, riding in a heated jeep, while Vance was holding the line with a piece of trash. But then he looked at the stovepipe. He saw the welds he'd labored over. He saw the way the aircraft struts were holding firm despite the leak. This wasn't just scrap metal. It was his testimony. It was the proof that a man with a torch and a brain was worth more than 1,000 pages of military regulations. If he was going to die, he was going to do it while breaking the back of the German war machine. If you want to understand the sheer psychological impact this scrap metal weapon had on the German high command, who believed they were being attacked by an experimental Allied heavy weaponry unit, hit that like button. Your engagement helps us honor the ingenuity of men who fought with nothing but their wits. The perspective from the German side was one of growing chaos. Captain Hans-Jürgen, commanding the lead company of the 501st, was staring through his cupola periscopes in disbelief. He had just lost his most experienced tank crew to a single shot from a position that shouldn't have held anything larger than a machine gun. The watch on the Rhine was supposed to be a lightning strike, a choreographed movement of steel that would crush the Americans before they could react. Instead, his momentum had been halted by a ghost. Jürgen's radio was alive with panicked chatter. His men were reporting heavy anti-tank fire from an unidentified caliber. They didn't think it was a bazooka. The explosion had been too large, the muzzle flash too bright. They began to refer to the ridge as Giraken, the Vulture's Ridge. They assumed the Americans had moved up a 90mm M3 anti-aircraft gun, or perhaps a new secret prototype. The psychological advantage of the King Tiger's supposed invincibility was evaporating. The German drivers were becoming hesitant, fearing that the next shot would turn their tanks into steel coffins. The turning point came at 7:25, as the German infantry reached the 50-yard mark. A sudden, heavy, crashing sound erupted from the woods behind Vance's position. For a terrifying second, Vance thought they had been completely encircled. He spun around, his hand on his Colt .45, only to see a sight that made his blood run cold. It was a convoy of American trucks and a single M20 armored car, retreating in total disarray. At the head of the column was Colonel Thorne. The by-the-book commander was leaning out of the armored car, his face pale, shouting for his driver to go faster. They were fleeing the village, abandoning the wounded in the motor pool cellar to save themselves. The road they were taking would lead them directly across the sights of the second King Tiger. Thorne didn't see the Tiger. He was too busy looking over his shoulder at the fog. "The idiot," Vance whispered. "He's driving right into the kill zone." Vance had a choice. He could stay hidden and let Thorne's column be vaporized of fate the colonel arguably deserved for abandoning his men. Or he could fire the stovepipe again, risking his own life and the weapon's structural integrity to draw the Tiger's attention. Vance didn't hesitate. He didn't do it for Thorne. He did it because those trucks were filled with the battalions, remaining radio equipment, and the only doctors left in the sector. He looked at Miller. "Miller, load the heavy one. The one with the double-wrapped charge. Corporal, the pipe's glowing. It'll blow." Miller was crying now, the blood from his ear mixing with tears. "Load it, or I'll throw you off this ridge myself." Miller fumbled with the satchel. Pulling out a monstrous projectile Vance had built, using 2 PIAT warheads lashed together with baling wire. It was a technical nightmare, aerodynamically unstable and dangerously heavy. As Miller slid it into the hot barrel, the smell of scorching explosives filled the air. The outer casing of the PIAT round was starting to soften against the hot steel of the brewery pipe. The second Tiger, number 213, spotted Thorne's convoy. Its long barrel began to dip, centering on the lead armored car. The German gunner was taking his time, ensuring a clean kill. Vance ignored the German infantry, who were now close enough that he could hear the crunch of their boots in the snow. He ignored the red hydraulic fluid spraying onto his boots. He focused on the turret of 213. He didn't use the tin sights this time. He felt the alignment in his shoulders, a shipyard welder's sense of true. He touched the wires together. The stovepipe didn't just fire, it screamed. The double charge detonated with a force that knocked Vance backward, his head slamming into a stone. The brewery pipe didn't shatter, but it buckled, the middle of the tube expanding like a snake swallowing a pig. The recoil was so violent that the P-38 struts bottomed out, the metal-and-metal impact sounding like a hammer on an anvil. The improvised double warhead wobbled through the air, trailing a jagged wake of white smoke. It struck the Tiger 213 on the side of the hull, just above the tracks. The combined force of two shaped charges didn't just penetrate. It ripped a 3-foot hole in the side of the tank. The explosion was so powerful, it actually lifted the front of the Tiger off the ground. The internal fuel tanks ruptured, and a fountain of burning diesel geysered out of the breach, coating the surrounding German infantry in liquid fire. The convoy stopped. Thorne looked up, his eyes widening as he saw the second Tiger erupt into flames just 50 yards from his vehicle. He looked toward the ridge, seeing the smoke rising from Vance's position. For a moment, their eyes might have met across the chaos, the man who followed the manual and failed, and the man who burned the manual to survive. But the victory came at a price. The stovepipe was finished. The barrel was warped beyond repair, and the hydraulic seals had completely disintegrated. And the German infantry, now enraged and seeing their armor destroyed, let out a collective roar. They were 30 yards away, and Silas Vance was lying in the snow, dazed, with a weapon that was now nothing more than a bent piece of pipe. The vulture had taken its second kill, but the nest was about to be overrun. Silas Vance reached for his carbine, knowing that the next few minutes would be fought not with engineering, but with cold, raw steel. At 7:35, on the morning of December 16th, Silas Vance looked at the twisted remains of the stovepipe and realized that he was no longer a soldier, he was a mechanic. Staring at a broken machine, the German infantry were 25 yards away, their grey coats ghost-like in the swirling fog. Private Miller was paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the burning Tiger II, as if the fire could protect him. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, and the heavy, sweet smell of the hydraulic fluid Vance had bled into the snow. But the watch on the Rhine wasn't over. Behind the two smouldering Panzers, the rest of the German column had come to a grinding halt. The narrow mountain pass was now a bottleneck of their own making. Vance saw the opportunity. If he could hold this pass, the entire German advance in this sector would be delayed by hours, perhaps days. He didn't have a functional launcher, but he had 7 more modified Piat rounds in the canvas bags. Vance didn't reach for his carbine. Instead, he grabbed a heavy 18-inch pipe wrench from his toolkit. With the infantry closing in, he began to beat the warped brewery pipe back into a semblance of a cylinder. Every strike of the wrench echoed like a bell through the valley, a rhythmic industrial sound that seemed to defy the chaos of the battlefield. The German soldiers paused, confused by the sound of a man working steel in the middle of a slaughter. That hesitation cost them. Vance jammed the last of the P-38's hydraulic fluid into the damaged reservoir and forced a PI'd round into the dented barrel. The fit was so tight he had to use his shoulder to ram it home. He didn't use the tripod anymore. It had been shattered by the recoil of the second shot. He propped the 80-pound monster against a granite outcrop, using his own greatcoat as a pad. Miller, the bag. Vance roared. The kid finally snapped. He didn't run. He crawled to Vance's side, his fingers fumbling with the ignition wires. For the next 6 hours, the ridge overlooking the Wiltz Road became a nightmare for the 2nd Panzer Division. It wasn't a clean fight. It was a grueling, mechanical war of attrition. Every time the Germans tried to push a tank past the burning wrecks, Vance would fire. The stovepipe would scream. The recoil would nearly shatter Vance's collarbone, and another German vehicle would erupt in flames. By 14 o'clock, the tally was staggering. A Panzer for trying to bypass through the Trest destroyed, 2 SDK FC. 251 half-tracks, carrying reinforcements, vaporized, a German Panther tank destroyer that had tried to duel with Vance from 500 yards silenced. The stovepipe, against every law of ballistics and every warning from the engineering manuals, was working. It was inaccurate, it was heavy, and it was terrifyingly loud, but it was killing everything that moved on that road. The ninth and final kill came as the sun began to dip behind the frozen ridges. A third King Tiger, the command vehicle for the battalion, attempted to bulldoze the wrecks out of the way. Vance was out of hydraulic fluid. The stovepipe's barrel was glowing a dull, angry red in the twilight. He knew that if he fired it again, the metal would likely fail. "Don't do it, Greasy," Miller whispered. His voice cracked and dry. "It's gonna blow. We've done enough." Vance looked at the motor pool below. He saw the American ambulances finally moving out, the wounded being evacuated because he had bought them the time they needed. He looked at the Tiger. He thought of the 57mm shells bouncing off the armor. He thought of the men who had died because the official weapons weren't good enough. "One more for the shipyard," Vance said. He touched the wires together for the 9th time. The stovepipe didn't just fire, it disintegrated. The breech of the brewery pipe finally gave way, the steel shrapnel slicing through the air. The explosion was so massive it blew Vance and Miller 10 feet backward. But the projectile had already left the tube. It struck the Tiger's engine deck, the shaped charge burning through the thin top armor and igniting the fuel tanks. When the smoke cleared, the Vulture of the Ardennes was gone. Only a few shards of twisted, blackened steel remained of the weapon. Vance lay in the snow, his face peppered with tiny fragments of metal, his right arm shattered by the final recoil. But the road was blocked. 9 German tanks and armored vehicles sat in a jagged, burning line, an impassable wall of junk that had halted a division. The resolution of the battle did not come with a parade. As the 101st Airborne finally began to move into the sector, and the fog lifted, the official record keepers arrived. Colonel Eris Thorne, who had returned only after the area was secured by a full regiment of infantry, stood over the wreckage of the stovepipe. He didn't look at Silas Vance with admiration. He looked at him with the cold, bureaucratic fury of a man whose authority had been bypassed. Thorne followed through on his threat. Because Vance had used unauthorized materials and endangered the lives of military personnel with an unproven device, he was denied any official commendation for the 9 tanks he had destroyed. The kills were officially credited to artillery fire and air support, despite the fact that no planes had flown that day and no artillery had been in range. Silas Vance was demoted to private and transferred to a Labour battalion, spending the rest of the war unloading crates in a supply depot in Merced. Miller, who survived the war, spent 40 years trying to get Vance's story heard. He wrote letters to the Pentagon, to historians, and to news agencies. For decades, he was ignored. Silas Greasy Vance died in 1982, back in Newport News, still working as a welder in the shipyards. He never spoke of the Ardennes. He never mentioned the Vulture. He simply went back to the steel he understood. If this story moved you, if it made you angry or inspired you, please hit that like button. Every single like tells the algorithm that these stories of the men the history books tried to forget deserve to be seen. The validation finally came in 1996. A Belgian farmer, clearing land near the old motor pool site, uncovered a 7-foot length of heavily scarred industrial piping and several strange, modified British Piat casings. A military historian from the University of Liege investigated the site and found the discarded hydraulic struts of a P-38 Lightning welded to the steel. The technical anomaly was so bizarre it made its way into an international military journal. When the researchers cross-referenced the physical evidence with the German after-action reports from the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, the truth emerged. The German records spoke in hushed, terrified tones of a superweapon on the ridge that had destroyed an entire armored spearhead. They had estimated it was a new 105mm recoilless rifle. They never suspected it was the work of a single man with a welding torch. Today, a small, unofficial monument stands in that Belgian pass. It isn't a statue of a general or a grand arch. It's a simple piece of industrial pipe welded into the shape of a cross. The local villagers call it the Welder's Pass. This is the definitive lesson of the Ardennes. Innovation doesn't always happen in the boardroom or the laboratory. It happens in the mud, in the dark, and in the hearts of men who refuse to accept that they have been given the wrong tools for the job. Silas Vance proved that in the face of total annihilation, a mechanic's intuition is worth more than a general's strategy. He didn't wait for permission to save his friends. He didn't wait for a manual to tell him how to fight. He simply looked at the debris of a failing war and welded it into a miracle. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Whether you're in the United States, Europe, or anywhere else in the world, your presence here helps keep the memory of men like Silas Vance alive. You're not just a viewer. You're the guardian of a history that the bureaucracy tried to bury. Don't let the vulture of the Ardennes fade into the fog again. Hit subscribe and join us for the next untold chapter of human courage. Until next time, remember, the best weapon in any conflict isn't made of steel, it's made of the will to use it.